Before sunrise, the Ohio River became something no lawmaker had planned for. Not water, not a border, a road. For most of her life, Margaret Garner had looked at that river from the Kentucky side and understood exactly what it meant. South Bank, slavery. North Bank, Ohio, free soil. And between them, a cold, moving wall wide enough to keep a human being trapped for a lifetime. But in January of 1856, winter did what no court had done for her. It stopped the river. It froze it hard enough for a family to walk across. So in the killing dark, Margaret Garner crossed it with her husband, her elderly in-laws, and 4 children pressed against the cold. Her boys were still small. Her baby was not yet a year old. Her little daughter Mary was only about 2. By dawn, Margaret stood inside a small house in Cincinnati, barefoot, exhausted, soaked through, believing she had carried her children into freedom. And then, she heard men outside, horses, voices, wood creaking under hard hands. They had found her, and in the few seconds left before the door broke open, Margaret Garner made a decision so terrible that America would spend generations trying to explain it. She reached for a knife, not because she did not love her children, because she believed the world had left her no other way to save them. This is the story of Margaret Garner, a 22-year-old enslaved mother, a frozen river, a law that turned free soil into a trap, and the morning when a nation was forced to ask whether a black woman was a person or property. To understand that morning, you cannot begin with the knife. You have to begin with the world that put it in her hand. Margaret was born in 1834 in Boone County, Kentucky, on a plantation called Maplewood. The people around her called her Peggy. She came into the world near the Ohio River, close enough to freedom that a person could almost imagine it was reachable. But the law had already decided what she was before she could speak. Because her mother was enslaved, Margaret was enslaved too. Owned at birth, owned before memory, owned before she had a name anyone in power cared to write down. Maplewood was not an imaginary kingdom of cruelty. It was an ordinary working plantation. Fields, livestock, a main house, outbuildings, cabins, ledgers, and in those ledgers human beings could be counted beside animals, tools, and land. That was the horror of slavery at its most ordinary. It did not need to announce itself as evil every morning. It wore a coat, kept accounts, went to church, signed papers, and called human children property. When the federal census came through the area in 1850, it did not record Margaret Garner as Margaret Garner. It recorded her as a 17-year-old enslaved female. No family story, no future, no private grief, just a line in a list. And even that cold entry carried a second wound. Margaret was described by the racial language of that time as light-skinned. In the world of American slavery, that detail often meant something everybody knew and nobody wanted to say plainly. It meant an enslaved woman somewhere had likely been sexually abused by a white man who could not be refused. Because refusal had no legal force when the law said your body belonged to someone else. So Margaret grew up with a face that carried evidence the law refused to recognize as a crime. As a young woman, she worked in the household. That sounds, from a distance, less brutal than field labor. It was not safety, it was proximity. It meant being under the eyes of the people who owned you from morning until night. It meant no private corner of the day. It meant no true distance between your body and the power that claimed it. You cleaned the rooms where decisions were made about your life. You served food to people who could sell your child. You heard conversations you were not meant to answer. You learned to make fear quiet enough that it would not show on your face. That was Margaret Garner's first education. Not reading, not law, not liberty, survival. In 1849, Maplewood changed hands. Major John Pollard Gaines left Kentucky for the Oregon Territory, and Maplewood passed into the control of his younger brother, Archibald K. Gaines. With that transfer, Archibald Gaines became master over Margaret's labor, her movement, her punishment, and her children. He could sell her. He could separate her from her husband. He could send her south. He could make decisions about her body and call them property management. And many historians believe he did worse than that. Over the years, Margaret gave birth to 4 children. 2 boys, Thomas and Samuel, a daughter, Mary, and the baby, Priscilla, often called Scylla. Observers in that period noticed what was difficult to ignore. Some of Margaret's children were very light-skinned, The suspicion at the time, and the belief of many historians since, is that Archibald Gaines fathered some of them. That would mean the man who owned Margaret also used her sexually, and then owned the children born from that abuse. Try to hold that truth without looking away. A woman forced to bear children inside the house of the man who controlled her. A wife in that house who may have understood what those children's faces meant. A household where the rage of the powerful could fall not on the man who abused, but on the woman who could not resist. That is not a single dramatic event. That is a weather system. It presses on a person day after day, year after year, until fear becomes the air. And Margaret had daughters. That is the part that matters most, because she knew what beautiful, light-skinned enslaved girls could become in the eyes of white men who believed the law belonged to them. She knew the footsteps, the silences, the doors that opened at night. She knew what a child could inherit from her mother besides a name. And she began to say something that must have frightened anyone who heard it. Robert Garner later remembered that Margaret had said more than once that she would rather see her children dead than living in slavery. Not because she had no tenderness left, because she had too much, because she knew slavery did not merely take labor. It reached into family, into marriage, into the mother's own arms, into the place where love should have been safest. Robert Garner was Margaret's husband. He was enslaved on a neighboring property, owned by James Marshall. Their marriage, like all marriages between enslaved people, had no full protection under the law. No document could stop an owner from selling a wife away from her husband. No vow could prevent a child from being taken. Still, Margaret and Robert made a family. That was an act of courage all by itself. A promise made under a system designed to make promises fragile. Imagine the tenderness that had to survive there. A child sleeping against a mother's chest. A father crossing between properties in the dark. A whispered plan. A small laugh that had to be swallowed quickly. Love existed there because enslaved people made it exist. Against the market. Against the lash. Against the auction block. Against every law that said they were less than human. And that is why the choice Margaret would later make is so unbearable. It did not come from the absence of love. It came from love trapped inside a world with no mercy. By the winter of 1856, the pressure around the Garner family was tightening. Kentucky was a border state, and border slavery had its own special terror. People liked to pretend it was milder than slavery farther south. Smaller farms, closer households, different crops, less distance from free states, but closeness to freedom did not make bondage gentle. It made it cruel in another way. The Ohio River was always there. Ohio was always there, a few miles away. And yet the law said you could be born, work, suffer, bear children, grow old, and die without ever crossing it as a free person. Even worse, enslaved people in Kentucky lived under the constant threat of being sold deeper south, down the river, into the cotton and sugar regions where labor was harsher, distance greater, and escape far less likely. For an enslaved family, sold south could mean disappearance. A husband gone, a wife gone, a child swallowed into another state. Names breaking apart across auction yards. And by the mid-1850s, the domestic slave trade had made people in the Upper South valuable in a terrible new way. As plantation demand expanded farther south, enslaved men, women, and children could be turned into cash through sale. Margaret understood that her children were not safe simply because they were near her. They were valuable. And valuable property could be moved. Then came the winter. A brutal cold settled over the Ohio Valley. The river froze. Not skimmed over, not crusted at the edges, frozen hard enough that people could cross on foot. For Margaret and Robert, that ice was not weather. It was a door. And doors like that did not stay open. The plan formed in secrecy. A group of 17 enslaved people would flee together. They would use a sleigh and horses. They would move through the night. They would travel roughly 18 miles toward the river near Covington, cross the ice into Cincinnati, and then seek help from the Underground Railroad. From there, if they were lucky, they could be moved north, farther than Ohio, farther than the reach of slave catchers, all the way to Canada. The plan was simple only if you say it quickly. In reality, every sound could ruin them. A dog, a lantern, a patrol, a wheel crack, a child coughing at the wrong moment, and if they failed, the punishment would not be private. It would be made into a lesson, the whip, the jail, the auction block, the deliberate destruction of family. Because slaveholders understood something very clearly. Hope was contagious, and if one family crossed the river, others might begin to believe the river could be crossed. So on the night of January 27, 1856, Margaret wrapped her children against the cold and ran. The sleigh cut through the darkness, horses breathing steam, snow packed hard beneath the runners. No one could speak freely. The children had to be kept quiet. The adults had to listen for danger in every shift of the wind. Behind them lay Maplewood, Boone County, the houses where they had been used, the names of men who claimed them. Ahead lay the river. For most of their lives it had been a barrier. That night it was a test. When they reached the riverbank before dawn, the Ohio stretched out as a pale frozen plain. Not a clean bridge, not safe, ice, gray, cracked, alive under pressure, the black water still waiting beneath it. Robert went ahead, testing steps. Margaret followed with the children. The ice groaned under them. That sound must have gone through the body like a warning from the earth. One wrong step, and the river would open. One break in the ice, and the cold water would take a child in seconds. Margaret's feet became wet, then numb, then cut by jagged ice. Still she moved, one step, then another, and another. A mother carrying the smallest lives she knew across a border the country had built to keep them from living. At last they reached the Ohio shore, free soil. For the first time in her life, Margaret Garner stood in a state where slavery was illegal. The group that had fled with them scattered into Cincinnati. Some made it onward, some escaped recapture. Their names did not become famous because their freedom did not end in catastrophe. The Garners were slower, they had small children, they had elderly family, they needed warmth, they needed shelter. So they stopped at the home of a free black man named Joe Kite, a relative of Margaret's, near the western edge of Cincinnati. There was a fire, a room, a chance to breathe. For a few hours it may have felt as though the worst was behind them. But the most monstrous part of the story is this. Standing on free soil did not make them safe. Because in 1850 the United States Congress had passed the Fugitive Slave Act, and that law turned the entire country into a hunting ground. An escaped enslaved person remained, in the eyes of federal law, property, even in a free state, even in Ohio, even after crossing the river. The law required federal officials and local authorities to help slaveholders recover runaways. It punished people who assisted escape. It denied the accused many basic protections. It made capture profitable. It made refusal dangerous. And it meant that the river Margaret had crossed did not end the reach of Kentucky. It only changed the scenery of the hunt. The ice had opened a door. The law had made the room beyond it another cage. Joe Kite knew the family could not remain in his house. He went for help. The person he needed was Levi Coffin, the Quaker abolitionist whose work in the Underground Railroad had helped many enslaved people move toward freedom. Coffin understood the danger immediately. The Garners had to be moved away from the river. They needed to be hidden farther west, then sent north through the network before the slave catchers closed in. It was the right plan. It came too late, because Archibald Gaines was already moving. When he discovered the escape, he crossed into Ohio and used the law exactly as it was designed to be used. He obtained warrants. He gathered officers, marshals, deputies, and local police, men with legal authority, men with weapons, men who would say they were not acting out of cruelty but duty. That is one of the oldest disguises evil has: paperwork. By morning, the posse found Joe Kite's house. Inside were Margaret, Robert, their children, Robert's parents, and others. Outside were armed men empowered by the United States government to return them to slavery. The men demanded entry. Inside, the family barricaded the doors. Furniture scraped across the floor, bodies pressed against wood. The air filled with panic and the animal clarity of people who know the trap has closed. Robert Garner had a revolver. He fired. A deputy marshal was wounded. The shots bought time, not escape. The men outside pushed harder. The door began to give. And in those final seconds before the house was breached, Margaret Garner understood what was coming. Her family would be dragged out. Her sons would be returned to slavery. Her daughters would be carried back across the river toward the same life she had endured, the same ownership, the same sexual terror, the same world where a child's body could become someone else's privilege. Every step over the ice, every cut on her feet, every hour of risk had led not to freedom but back to Archibald Gaines. Unless she did the one thing he could not reverse. Margaret reached for a knife. There is no way to make the next part easy, and it should not be made easy. But it must be told with care. Margaret seized her little daughter Mary, about 2 years old, and before the men could stop her, she killed the child. She wounded the boys. She tried to reach the baby. She cried for help from her mother-in-law, asking her to help kill the children. The older woman could not. She broke down in horror. Then the men were on Margaret. The knife was taken. The children were seized. The room that had been a shelter became the scene America could not forget. Mary was dead. The others were wounded. And Margaret Garner, according to witnesses, was calm. Not empty. Not unfeeling. Calm in the terrible way a person can be when the worst decision has already passed through them and left nothing behind but certainty. She said she would rather kill all of her children than see them return to slavery. That statement is the center of the story. Not the knife, not the blood, the belief behind it. A mother looked at the law, the marshals, the owner, the river, the auction block, and the future waiting for her children, and she believed the grave was the only place slavery could not follow. That does not make the act less terrible. It makes the world that produced it impossible to excuse. News of the raid spread through Cincinnati quickly. Reporters wrote the scene in harsh detail. Crowds gathered. The city argued. The nation argued. Some people saw only a crime. Others saw an indictment. Abolitionists understood at once that Margaret Garner's act revealed something statistics could never fully prove. Slavery did not merely force people to work. It did not merely steal wages. It did not merely break backs. It made a loving mother believe death was a safer future for her child than life under American law. Southern defenders of slavery tried to turn the story another way. They called Margaret savage. They blamed abolitionists. They treated the horror as proof of black incapacity rather than proof of white cruelty. But the question would not go away. What kind of system must exist for a mother's mercy to become a knife? The timing made everything more explosive. In 1856, the United States was already tearing open over slavery. Kansas was bleeding from violence between pro-slavery and anti-slavery forces. Congress was bitterly divided. The Fugitive Slave Act had enraged much of the North. The country was only a few years from civil war, though most people did not yet know how close the fire really was. Then came Margaret Garner, a young mother in chains, a dead child, a free state forced to help return survivors to bondage. A courtroom question that sounded legal, but was really moral. Was Margaret Garner a human being who could be tried for murder? Or was she property to be returned to her owner? The trial became one of the most watched fugitive slave cases of its time. Crowds packed the courtroom. People stood outside in the cold. Officials feared violence. The legal battle turned on the ugliest contradiction in American law. If Ohio treated Margaret as a person, then she could be charged with killing Mary. That might mean prison. It might mean execution. But it would also mean the state recognized her as a person with legal responsibility. If the Federal Fugitive Slave Act prevailed, then Margaret would not be tried first as a mother who had committed a crime. She would be processed as property, returned to Kentucky, returned to Gaines, returned to the world she had tried to escape. Her lawyer, John Jolliffe, was an abolitionist, and he took a position that seems almost impossible until you understand the trap. He fought to have his own client tried for murder, because a murder trial in Ohio meant Margaret would be seen by the court as a human being. A terrible recognition, but recognition all the same. To be condemned as a person was, in that moment, better than being returned as a thing. Jolliffe also challenged the Fugitive Slave Act. He argued against the machinery that forced free state citizens and officials to serve slavery. He looked for any opening in the law that could keep Margaret in Ohio. One argument focused on earlier trips Margaret may have taken into Ohio with the consent of those who owned her. If she had once been brought voluntarily into a free state by her owners, Jolliffe argued, then perhaps she had become free already. It was a desperate legal path, but desperate paths were the only ones slavery left. Margaret herself was clear. She would rather be hanged than return to slavery, hanged as a person, rather than live as property. During the case, the abolitionist and women's rights advocate Lucy Stone visited Margaret in jail. Stone understood the sexual violence embedded in slavery. She understood what the light skin of enslaved children often revealed. In court, she spoke of the degradation forced on enslaved women and said she could not condemn Margaret for wanting her child beyond the reach of chains. Margaret's own recorded words are few. Most of her life was written by others: census takers, reporters, lawyers, officials, men with pens who decided what counted. But the words we do have from her are devastatingly consistent. She was not sorry in the way the law expected. She said she would rather her children die than live as slaves. That does not mean she had no grief. It means her grief had been forced into a shape most of us pray never to understand. For weeks the city watched. The case was not only about one woman. It was about the lie at the center of the republic. A nation could write liberty into its founding language and still authorize men to cross into a free state and drag a mother back into bondage. It could call Ohio free while making Ohio obey Kentucky's claim. It could declare a child dead by her mother's hand a tragedy, while refusing to call the world that made that hand move a crime. Finally, the federal commissioner ruled. The Fugitive Slave Act came first. Margaret Garner and her surviving family were to be returned to Kentucky, not because the killing did not matter, not because Ohio had no horror at what happened, but because federal law treated Margaret as property claimed by Archibald Gaines. The courtroom had answered the question in the coldest possible way. Property must be returned. There was an agonizing twist. Ohio officials later tried to pursue a murder charge. In other words, after the federal process had ordered Margaret back, the state moved toward treating her as a person. But by then, Gaines had already taken the family away. The law found Margaret's humanity too late to protect her from being returned as property. And once she was back in the hands of the system she had fled, her punishment was not only legal, it was geographical. Archibald Gaines wanted distance from the attention the case had brought. So Margaret and Robert were sent south. The place she had feared for her children became the place she was carried into. New Orleans, then Mississippi. Plantation labor deeper in the slave-holding South. The frozen river had failed to save her. The free state had failed to hold her. The courtroom had failed to name her human in time, and the South was waiting. On one leg of that forced journey, the family traveled by steamboat. A collision occurred on the water. In the chaos, Margaret and her infant daughter, Scylla, were thrown overboard. Margaret survived. Scylla drowned. The baby who had crossed the frozen Ohio River against her mother's body was gone. Some accounts said Margaret did not show the grief people expected. Some suggested she seemed almost relieved. Not because she did not love the baby, because in the broken moral universe slavery had built around her, another child was now beyond the reach of sale, rape, labor, and chains. That is what slavery did. It poisoned hope so deeply that a child's death could be imagined as safety. Margaret did not live long after that. In 1858, a typhoid epidemic moved through the region where she was enslaved. She fell ill. She was only 24 years old, still enslaved, still owned, still far from the river that had briefly turned into a road. Robert was with her near the end. Years later, as a free man, he remembered her final message. She told him not to marry again in slavery, to live in hope of freedom. Think about that. After everything, after Maplewood, after the frozen river, after the house in Cincinnati, after Mary, after Scylla, after the courtroom, after Mississippi, Margaret Garner's final instruction was not surrender. It was freedom. Not freedom for herself. That chance had been taken. But freedom as a direction. A duty. A thing Robert had to keep facing even after the woman who had crossed the ice beside him was gone. And he did. When the Civil War came, Robert Garner joined the Union Army. The man who had once fired a revolver inside Joe Kite's house fought openly on the side that would destroy slavery in the United States. He lived to see the institution fall. He lived as a free man, and in 1870 a Cincinnati reporter found him living with his 2 surviving sons. The boys who had been wounded that winter morning were grown, alive, free. Robert told the story. He remembered Margaret. He made sure her name did not vanish into the ledgers that had once refused to record it. That matters, because slavery tried to control not only bodies but memory. It renamed people, separated people, sold people away from witnesses, reduced whole lives to inventory marks. And yet Margaret Garner could not be erased. Her story passed through newspapers, through abolitionist speeches, through court records, through family memory, through art. After the Civil War, the painter Thomas Satterwhite Noble created a work inspired by her called the Modern Medea. More than a century later, Toni Morrison encountered the history of Margaret Garner and transformed its moral wound into the novel Beloved. That novel did not simply retell the case. It carried the haunting question forward. What does slavery do to love? What remains after a mother chooses death over capture? How does the past live inside the house long after the law has changed? Margaret's life also entered opera, scholarship, museum memory, and public history in Cincinnati, near the river she crossed. The woman a census taker would not name became impossible to forget. But we should be careful here. Memory can soften what it is supposed to preserve. It can turn a real woman into a symbol so quickly that the woman disappears again. Margaret Garner was not only a metaphor. She was not only an abolitionist argument. She was not only the seed of a masterpiece. She was a young black woman who had been owned, abused, pursued, judged, returned, sold south, and dead by 24. She had a husband, children, bleeding feet on ice, a baby against her chest, a daughter named Mary, a mind clear enough to understand exactly what slavery would do if it got her children back, and a world cruel enough to make her believe only death could stop it. So when we return to that house by the river, we must return honestly, not to stare at violence, not to turn pain into spectacle, but to see the machinery around the moment, the law that followed her, the owner who claimed her, the officers who enforced the claim, the court that weighed personhood against property and chose property first, the nation that made free soil conditional, the ordinary men who could go home afterward and believe they had only done their jobs. Margaret Garner did not create the horror in that room. Slavery created it. The Fugitive Slave Act carried it across the river. The courts protected it. The market profited from it. Respectable people normalized it. And when the whole machine finally cornered one mother and her children in a small Cincinnati house, America acted shocked by the knife instead of the world that had made the knife seem like mercy. That is why the story still hurts. Because it refuses easy distance. It does not allow us to say only monsters built slavery. It was built by people with titles, by voters, by judges, by ministers who looked away, by neighbors who preferred order to justice, by officials who valued property claims more than a mother's body, by a country that could speak beautifully of liberty while sending armed men to recover children. Margaret Garner's question is not, what kind of mother could do this? That question is too small. The real question is, what kind of world leaves a mother believing this is the last act of love available to her? The answer is American slavery. Not as an abstract evil, not as a chapter heading, not as a number in a textbook, but as a force intimate enough to enter a mother's arms and poison the meaning of protection. Mary Garner never grew up enslaved. That fact is almost too painful to hold. It is not comfort, it is not redemption. It is the smallest, darkest victory imaginable. The only victory slavery left her mother. Margaret died still enslaved, still young, still owned on paper. But she is not only a line in someone else's record now. She has a name, Margaret Garner. She crossed the frozen Ohio River carrying her children toward a freedom the law refused to honor. She stood on free soil and discovered the country had made that soil a trap. And when the door broke open, she forced America to see the truth it had spent generations hiding behind ledgers and laws. A river can freeze. A courtroom can lie. A ledger can erase a name. But a mother's refusal can outlive all of them. The ice melted. The law fell. Margaret Garner's name remained.